In March 2020, the waters of the coast of Palm Beach, Florida were calm and welcoming, a typical spring day for diving enthusiasts. It was here, near the Breakers Reef, a well-known diving site roughly 1.5 miles offshore, that Molly Giz Flynn, 37 years old and a local of South Florida, boarded the Southern Comfort, a commercial dive charter boat. She wasn't a beginner. Molly had diving experience, a husband who often joined her on these outings, and a strong comfort level with open water. The boat was running a standard 2-dive charter with a licensed captain and crew. Divers were expected to enter the water in pairs, surface when ready, and reboard via the stern ladder. Industry standard procedure requires dive boats to remain in neutral, engines off or disengaged from the propellers, while divers are in the water. It's a safety measure so well established that most operators won't move the vessel at all until every diver is accounted for and back on board. But on this trip, that protocol wasn't exactly followed. After a successful dive with good conditions, Molly and her husband surfaced. They swam toward the back of the boat to reboard. The Southern Comfort was not stationary. For reasons later cited in court, the captain was attempting to reposition the vessel for boarding and had placed it in reverse gear, slowly backing up to assist divers in reaching the ladder. There was no verbal announcement, no horn, no one assigned to watch the water behind the boat, and the dive ladder was not yet deployed. As Molly reached the stern, the water around her shifted. The propellers, still spinning, created a suction current. It wasn't fast or violent, but it was strong enough to displace a swimmer. Before she could react, and before her husband could reach her, Molly was pulled under the swim platform and into the propeller arc. The contact was instant and devastating. The twin stainless steel blades struck her multiple times, each rotation delivering violent, deep cuts to her lower body. One of the blades entered through the back of her thigh and exited above her pelvis, tearing through arteries, nerves, and muscle in a single rotation. Another pass split her calf open down to the bone. The water behind the vessel erupted into a thick red plume, the kind that makes witnesses freeze in place because their brains can't process what they've just seen. The scene turned horrific in seconds. Molly's husband, swimming just a few feet away, saw her vanish beneath the waterline, followed by a spray of blood that rose and spread across the surface like ink. On deck, passengers heard the thrum of the engine stutter for a moment, then a scream. Crew members scrambled to the stern, but what they saw left them in shock. Molly had been dragged out of the water, but her legs and abdomen were torn apart. The flesh along one thigh was hanging in ribbons, barely connected to the bone. Her femoral artery had been completely severed. Her lower abdomen had been opened wide, exposing muscle and internal organs. Blood poured out onto the deck, thick, pooling, and unrelenting, until the white fiberglass of the stern was stained entirely red. She was still conscious at first. Witnesses said she tried to speak but couldn't get the words out. Her mouth moved, her eyes wide, gasping not from water but from the pain and blood loss. Her husband held her hand as the crew started CPR, even though it was already clear her lower body had been mangled beyond recognition. An emergency call was made as the boat sped back to shore. Paramedics met the boat at the dock and took over resuscitation efforts, but there was too much damage, too many vessels torn, too many tissue destroyed, and too much blood lost too fast. Molly was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner's report left little room for ambiguity. Her injuries were classified as a massive sharp force trauma, consistent with multiple marine propeller strikes. Her femoral arteries had been severed, multiple bones in her legs and pelvis were shattered. One blade had opened her from hip to midsection. The trauma was labeled unsurvivable. The aftermath revealed just how preventable it actually was. The captain admitted to operating the vessel in reverse while divers were still in the water. He had not checked the stern, had not assigned a lookout, and had not warned the divers. Worse, he had done this before. He routinely used reverse throttle to maintain boat position, despite repeated industry guidance advising against it. He was later charged with misdemeanor negligence causing death, a charge that some said did not reflect the sheer brutality of what occurred. In court, it came out that there was no safety briefing that warned about propeller danger, and no policy in place to ensure engines remained disengaged until all divers were aboard. The boat also lacked propeller guards, despite being used for close contact diving excursions. Her husband later said in legal testimony that watching Molly get torn apart in front of him was something he would never forget. He described how fast it was, how she didn't scream at first, how the water turned color instantly. Other passengers were traumatized, some had to be sedated at the marina. The captain reportedly stood in silence as the crew mopped up blood from the deck. The Ortega Highway, officially known as State Route 74, cuts through the Santa Ana Mountains in Southern California like a scar, a narrow winding path of asphalt that's both breathtaking and dangerous. Popular with commuters and day trippers alike, it's also notorious for collisions, thanks to its blinding turns, steep drop-offs, and uneven shoulders. On June 19, 2015, 20-year-old Elijah Alexander Ward set out on a drive along that same route. He was from Foothill Ranch, a community in Orange County, and familiar with the terrain. He wasn't speeding, racing, or out joyriding. Reports later confirmed he had no drugs or alcohol in his system, and the trip appeared to be routine. Now, somewhere along the stretch between Lake Eleanor and San Juan Capistrano, something went wrong. Elijah's car, a blue Scion, left the road. The exact reason is still unclear. It may have been a swerve to avoid an animal, or a simple overcorrection in one of the sharper curves. But regardless of the trigger, the vehicle caneered off the highway and rolled into a ditch beyond the shoulder. The wreck was violent enough to disable the car. Windows shattered, the roof crumbled, but no one witnessed the crash directly, and it happened in a spot that made the vehicle difficult to see from the road. Now, from inside the crushed vehicle, Elijah managed to crawl out. He was alive, injured yes, but able to move. At this point, his cell phone was dead. He was stranded in the mountains without the ability to call for assistance. But Elijah did what anyone in his position might do. He started walking. He left the crash site on foot and made his way back toward the road, following the narrow edge of the pavement in hopes of flagging someone down or reaching an area with reception. The temperature was dropping, and it was late evening by then, and the light was beginning to fade. The Ortega Highway has no constant lighting beyond the reach of passing headlights. It's pure darkness. The road is also tight, just 2 lanes, with very little room for pedestrians. There are no sidewalks, no shoulders wide enough to safely walk. The environment is steep on one side and often lined with guardrails or ditches on the other. Still, Elijah kept walking. Now, roughly 1.5 miles where his vehicle had crashed, he continued to make progress alongside the road. He may have been limping. Records suggest he suffered injuries to his legs, but he kept going. He likely thought he was close to finding help. Then, a white or cream-colored car approached from behind. There was no time to react, no horn, no swerving. The vehicle struck him at full speed, and it did not stop. The force of the impact threw Elijah forward. The vehicle continued driving, leaving him behind in the dark. It was a hit and run, later described by investigators as deliberate in its failure to assist. Another driver spotted Elijah's body shortly afterward and called authorities. When paramedics arrived, they found him unresponsive on the pavement. Despite emergency measures, nothing could be done. He had suffered multiple blunt force injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle at high speed. The trauma included fractures to the pelvis, ribs, and lower limbs. His injuries were not survivable. The California Highway Patrol took over the investigation. At the scene, they recovered fragments from the striking vehicle's front end, pieces of a headlight assembly, parts of a bumper grill, and paint scrapings. Based on the evidence, they determined the car involved was likely a Subaru model, possibly a Legacy or an Outback, built between 2010 and 2012. It had significant damage to the front right side, but despite media coverage and public appeals, the driver was never identified, and no witnesses came forward to confirm seeing the vehicle immediately before or after the collision, and no vehicle matching the damage profile was located in the days or weeks that followed. Elijah survived a pretty brutal car crash just to be ran over by a car that he thought maybe was his savior. In early spring 2021, the weather in central Wisconsin was beginning to shift. Mornings were still crisp, but daylight stretched longer each day. On the outskirts of the town of St. Lawrence in Waupaca County, the Satch Schneider family was going through the daily routines. They lived on a modest rural farm surrounded by flat fields and groves of trees that were just starting to bud. Like many families in the area, work started early and ended only when the sun dipped below the horizon. That morning, 43-year-old Caleb Satch Schneider was tending to chores in the barnyard. A well-used skid steer loader, a compact machine commonly found on farms for moving heavy materials, was parked just outside of one of the sheds. The machine had been in service for years. According to neighbors and records later reviewed by authorities, Caleb had removed the front safety door on the loader long ago, finding it cumbersome during tasks that required frequent in and out movement. Caleb had several children. The youngest, a toddler, often followed him around on the property. The family was close-knit, and like many rural households, it wasn't uncommon for kids to be near the machinery, animals, or work being done. That morning, the child had been walking near his father as Caleb prepared to clean out an area near the barn using the loader's front bucket. The skid steer was idling as Caleb maneuvered it into position. The bucket was raised, ready to scoop out manure or bedding from the pen. At some point during this movement, the toddler approached the machine unnoticed. There were no witnesses close enough to see the exact sequence of events that followed, but what is known is that Caleb was inside the cab and operating the loader's arm controls. Because the safety door had been removed and no safety interlock system was activated, the bucket could be moved freely without restriction, and in a matter of seconds the situation turned tragic. The child had either climbed or wandered too close to the pivot point of the loader arm, a zone known to be extremely dangerous. Caleb, likely unaware of the child's precise position, activated the control to lower the bucket. Without the door or any backup warning system, there was nothing to prevent or alert him that something was wrong. The loader's hydraulic arms began to descend. The space between the steel cross member and the frame of the skid steer narrowed with each movement of the control stick. In that confined space, the child was caught between two solid, unyielding structures. The machine did not stall or stop. It functioned exactly as it was designed to. The result was crushing force with no way to reverse it fast enough. Only after Caleb left the cab and looked around did he notice what had happened. Emergency responders were called immediately. The location was rural, so it took time for first units to arrive, but when they did, it was already too late. The child had sustained devastating trauma to the upper body and head. Paramedics could not revive him. He was declared dead on the property. An investigation was launched by the Waupaca County Sheriff's Office, assisted by child services and forensic investigators. The condition of the skid steer and what they found disturbed even experienced safety officers. The machine's original safety features had been disabled or removed. The front door had been taken off, which by itself deactivates several internal interlocks designed to prevent movement of the lift arms. These mechanisms exist specifically to prevent accidental injury. Additionally, the loader was in use without any warning markings or external observers. There were no visual indicators, no backup sensors, and no audible cues that might have alerted Caleb to a hazard behind or beneath the loader's arms. Further investigation revealed that this was not the first time a child on the property had been injured in connection with farm equipment. In 2017, one of Caleb's other children had been struck by the same skid steer. That event had resulted in serious but non-fatal injuries. And in a separate situation, another child had suffered a fractured leg on the property. These prior cases raised questions about the overall safety practices and whether appropriate precautions were being followed. The Waupaca County District Attorney's Office filed charges, and Caleb was charged with second-degree recklessness homicide and neglect of a child resulting in death. The legal bias for the charges rested not only in the fatal event itself, but also a pattern of prior safety concerns and the removal of critical protective systems from dangerous machinery. In court proceedings, prosecutors emphasized the foreseeability of such an incident. Experts testified that the interlock systems on skid steers exist specifically because the machines are compact, have large blind spots, and exert a massive pressure in small areas. The lack of a door removed the primary barrier that prevents users from operating the lift arms while someone else is nearby. The absence of supervision for the toddler near active machinery further supported the claims of recklessness. The defense did not dispute what happened. Instead, they focused on Caleb's remorse and the reality of real life, where children are often near work equipment and where families don't always follow OSHA-like protocols. His legal team argued for leniency, citing that Caleb would live with the consequences forever. In the end, a plea deal was reached. Caleb was sentenced to 1 year probation, ordered to complete a comprehensive machinery safety course, and required to speak publicly about the dangers of improper equipment use and the consequences of safety shortcuts. The landscape at Jökulsárlón, Iceland's famous glacial lagoon, feels otherworldly. Jagged blue ice floats silently across the frigid water. Seals dart between drifting chunks, and the vast open sky hangs low over black volcanic sand. It's one of Iceland's most popular tourist spots, a location that draws thousands every year for its surreal beauty and its unique amphibious boat tours that take visitors directly into the lagoon. In August 2015, Sheila Donovan and her husband Michael Boyd had brought their teenage son to Iceland for a family vacation. The trip included stops across the southern coast and had been carefully planned. That day, they had just completed a sightseeing flight with a local helicopter tour company operating near the lagoon. It was late morning or early afternoon where they returned from the flight and walked back to the general area where vehicles waited for tour guests. The weather was clear, the landing area was unmarked, with no fixed fencing or clearly defined pedestrian zones. This was a working space used by multiple tour operators. Helicopters, buses, and amphibious craft all shared the same general area. Tourists, many unfamiliar with the layout or the flow of vehicle movement, often walked freely through the open ground. Sheila, Michael, and their son had been standing together near the gravel access route, speaking casually and observing the scenery. Nearby, one of the large, brightly colored amphibious tour vehicles was parked after finishing a lagoon circuit. These massive machines, retrofitted to operate on both water and land, weighed several tons and had large, elevated cabins with limited visibility toward the rear. A crew member boarded the amphibious craft, intending to reposition it before the next group of passengers arrived. The vehicle's rear view camera, its only consistent method of seeing directly behind, was inoperative. No audible beeping alarm had been installed, no staff member was present on the ground to help the vehicle's movement, and there were no mirrors that allowed the driver to see the immediate space behind the rear bumper. Without warning to those on foot nearby, the driver placed the vehicle in reverse. Its engines rumbled as it began to slowly roll backward. The Donovan family was standing in the same area, unaware of the vehicle's movement. According to later investigation records and witness statements, the vehicle moved in a straight line. No sudden acceleration, no deviation, just a gradual reverse motion. Michael recalled hearing the sound of the engine too late to realize what was happening. Their son was positioned slightly apart from them and was able to jump out of the way. Michael was clipped by the part of the vehicle and thrown to the ground, but Sheila, standing directly into its path, was struck squarely by the rear tires. What was followed was immediate chaos. People began shouting, and staff members rushed to stop the vehicle, which rolled just a few feet more before halting. Witnesses who ran to help found Sheila pinned and motionless. The vehicle had run her over with its full weight. An amphibious bus weighing close to 20,000 pounds. Emergency responders were called immediately, and medical assistance was dispatched to the scene. But by the time help arrived, there was nothing they could do. The force of the impact had caused catastrophic injuries, and authorities determined she died instantly. Investigators from the Icelandic Transport Authority and the South Iceland Police launched a formal inquiry into the accident. What they uncovered raised serious concerns about safety standards at the lagoon. First, like I said, the reversing camera on the vehicle had been out of order and had not been repaired. Second, the driver lacked the appropriate class of commercial license to operate that specific vehicle. Third, there were no visual barriers or restricted zones separating pedestrian access from moving equipment. And finally, the company operating the tours had no staff member positioned behind the vehicle during the maneuver. During the movement, a basic safety practice used globally when reversing large machines in public areas. In Iceland, the accident led to regulatory changes. New protocols were introduced, requiring designated pedestrian zones, functional backup cameras on all amphibious vehicles, driving licensing audits, and audible reversing alarms. Signage and barriers were added in key areas, and operators were required to have spotters on the ground when maneuvering vehicles in populated zones.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.